Hey, I'm Vlad with Globmarble, and these are the top 10 mistakes that noobs make with epoxy. Mistake number 1, the biggest, worst enemy you can possibly have is dust. Even the smallest amount of dust is going to show up on your final form, and it's going to create these very ugly, weird bubble-like imperfections on your surface. Now let's hypothetically say that dust is something that you really can't avoid. The best thing that you could do is take a sprayer, fill it with water, spray it up into the air, and let it drop down. This is going to capture all the dust in the air and bring it down to the floor and make sure that it stays there and doesn't get picked up by the traction of your feet. Another precaution you could take is covering whatever you're casting with a cardboard box. This is why I can't wear white clothes. Mistake number 2 is never pour a coat that's way too thick. Epoxy cures by a hydrothermic reaction, which means that it heats up the more mass you have of that epoxy. The more spread out your epoxy is and the thinner it is, the slower it's going to cure, and vice versa. Now you think it might be a good idea to make your epoxy cure as fast as possible, but that's not always the case. If the epoxy gets way too hot, what's going to end up happening is it might, 1, crack completely, or 2, it might discolor the epoxy and turn a very disgusting shade of yellow-brown. Instead, you can pour multiple thin coats and just stack them on top of each other. This leads me to mistake number 3. If you're going to cast epoxy that's colored in multiple coats, you're going to see from side view that the colors might not always match up. The best way to fix it is to find out the total amount of epoxy you're going to use, pour the part B into a separate container, and mix all the color into the part B. That way, when you're adding the part A in different segments, you're always going to have the same consistent color. Mistake number 4 is pouring on a surface that hasn't been completely cleaned and has some particles left over on it. If you have that, basically what's going to end up happening is you'll get something called comets, which are these discolored streaks on the surface, which don't look that good, in my opinion. Mistake number 5 is pouring on a surface that isn't completely level. Now, if you're working on a table or a river table or something like that, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a lopsided pour. If you're working on a concrete floor, you could end up having pits and peaks on your surface, and that's going to end up all the epoxy drooping down into the low points. You can fix that either with a floor grinder or self-leveling concrete. Mistake number 6, do not keep the epoxy in your bucket. Now, we already said that epoxy has a hydrothermic reaction, and the more mass it has, the faster it's going to cure. If you keep the epoxy in that bucket for too long, it's going to cure up in the bucket and you're going to have a lot less time to work with it, or it's going to be completely unworkable by the time you pour it. Mistake number 7 is forgetting to sand the surfaces that you're pouring on. If you're pouring over a primer, you have to sand it. If you're pouring over another layer of epoxy, you have to sand it. Otherwise, it's not going to stick, and any amount of force could just lodge those two pieces apart. After you finish sanding with about 220 grit sandpaper, wipe away all the particles and the dust with some alcohol. Mistake number 8, do not ever scrape the sides of your bucket and pour that onto whatever you're pouring. A lot of times epoxy isn't fully mixed around the edges, and so if you scrape that out and pour it onto wherever you're pouring, everything is going to look fine except for one spot, which has unmixed epoxy, and it's just going to be wet. It's going to be this disgusting sticky substance that you have, and you're not going to be able to fix that. Now, mistake number 9 is we all know we get rid of bubbles using a butane torch. The problem is if you hold the butane torch over the epoxy too long. What that does is it creates a brown spot, it's going to burn the epoxy, and you're going to ruin the project that you're working on. And finally, mistake number 10, read the instructions and use the right ratios. A lot of times people pour 2 parts B instead of 2 parts A. This causes the epoxy not to fully cure, and you're going to pour whatever you poured, and it's going to be wet by the time you come back. It will never cure. Now, with that said, we do have a few epoxy tutorial videos, and be sure to comment, like, and subscribe.